When German generals reviewed their intelligence reports in the summer of 1944, many dismissed them as exaggerations. The idea that America could roll tanks straight off assembly lines and put them into combat in Normandy seemed absurd. To men trained in the traditions of German engineering where machines were crafted with precision and care, the very thought was laughable. A tank was not a loaf of bread. It could not simply be produced, shipped and driven into battle without painstaking preparation. Yet as the battles in France intensified, the evidence became impossible to deny. The Americans were doing exactly that. The first whispers reached German high command shortly after D-Day. Panzer commanders reported encountering waves of Sherman tanks that seemed to appear endlessly, as if conjured from thin air, knock one out, and two more rolled up to take its place. At first, this was attributed to exaggeration by shaken soldiers. But then field reports confirmed that American tanks carried markings indicating they had been manufactured only weeks earlier, some even days before the invasion. The implications were staggering. The Americans had turned industrial production into a weapon every bit as lethal as artillery. For German generals steeped in a culture of elite craftsmanship, this was incomprehensible. Their own tanks, the fearsome Tigers and Panthers, were marvels of engineering meticulously designed and built with precision. But they were slow to produce, expensive to maintain, and difficult to transport. America, by contrast, had chosen mass production. The Sherman was not perfect, but it was reliable, easy to build, and easy to repair. For every Tiger that rolled out of a German factory, America rolled out dozens of Shermans. Now those Shermans were arriving in Normandy almost as fast as they left Detroit, Chicago, or Pittsburgh. The shock lay not only in the numbers, but in the logistics. Germany's war machine was already straining under the weight of Allied bombing. Factories were hit, rail lines destroyed, fuel supplies dwindling. America faced none of these constraints. Its factories operated at full capacity, protected by oceans and supplied by vast reserves of raw material. From factory floor to French hedgerows, the pipeline of tanks seemed unbroken. German generals who had once laughed at American industrial methods now realized they were fighting an enemy whose greatest weapon was abundant. Captured officers later confessed their disbelief at how quickly America could deliver. One recalled seeing Shermans with factory-fresh paint and brand-new parts still gleaming. To him, it was as if the tanks had rolled directly off the assembly line onto a ship, across the Atlantic, and into battle. "We built machines to last a lifetime," he admitted, "but they built machines to win a war." That distinction, he realized too late, made all the difference. The soldiers on the ground felt this imbalance most acutely. German tank crews, proud of their Tigers and Panthers, were forced to confront the reality that no matter how many Shermans they destroyed, more would always come. Knock one out in a hedgerow ambush, and the next day another appeared in its place. For German infantry, the psychological toll was immense. They fought not just against tanks, but against the sense that the enemy's supply was endless. America's factories, thousands of miles away, loomed as an invisible but ever-present adversary. The philosophy behind it baffled the Germans. To them, a tank was a masterpiece of engineering, a symbol of technological superiority. To the Americans, a tank was a tool, and tools could be replaced. Better to have 10 reliable Shermans than one perfect Tiger. This difference in approach, amplified by America's unmatched production lines, meant that the battlefield was soon crowded with American armor. For German generals, watching their elite panzers outnumbered and overwhelmed, the realization was bitter. They had built for quality, but America had built for victory. The logistical miracle extended beyond production, shipping tanks across the Atlantic in vast convoys, unloading them at hastily built ports, and driving them into battle within days required coordination on a scale Germany could scarcely imagine. Allied engineers laid pipelines, built depots and managed fleets of transport ships that carried the arsenal of democracy straight into France. German generals, already reeling from the landings, were stunned at the speed with which America sustained its momentum. Normandy was not only a battle of soldiers and tanks, it was a battle of factories and shipping lanes, and in that war, America was unassailable. In hindsight, the reports of tanks rolling straight from assembly lines into combat were not exaggerations but reflections of a reality Germany could not match. America had mastered the art of industrial war, where production itself became a weapon. German generals who once mocked the Sherman as inferior now recognized that it was not the machine but the system behind it that made the difference. A tank that could be replaced faster than it could be destroyed was a weapon more powerful than any Tiger. The laughter that had once echoed in briefing rooms turned into silence. America had shown that in modern war, the assembly line was as important as the battlefield. German generals who had prided themselves on precision could not believe what they were seeing. Tanks delivered fresh from the factory floor, still smelling of oil and paint, crushing their defenses in Normandy. It was a lesson learned too late, and one that would haunt them long after the war was lost. The shock of America's tank production did not stop at numbers alone. German generals had long prided themselves on their armored forces, believing the Tiger and Panther tanks to be the pinnacle of battlefield dominance, and in many ways their thick armor could shrug off most Allied shells, and their guns could destroy a Sherman at long range with terrifying ease. Yet for every Panther that left a German factory, Allied intelligence reported that nearly a dozen Shermans rolled out of American plants. That ratio was not merely troubling, it was catastrophic. The pace of production stunned German intelligence officers who analyzed the report. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh ran 24 hours a day, with shifts of workers, men and women alike, turning out tanks with the same efficiency as automobiles. America's auto industry, already a marvel of modern manufacturing, had been repurposed for war. Assembly lines that once produced sedans and coupes now delivered armored vehicles by the hundreds. German generals, accustomed to their own slower artisan-style production, could hardly comprehend it. Tanks in Germany were built like luxury cars, each one meticulously crafted, whereas American tanks were stamped, welded, and rolled out with ruthless efficiency. What troubled the Germans most was that this system allowed the Allies to recover from losses almost instantly. A German tank destroyed in Normandy represented months of labor, scarce resources, and irreplaceable craftsmanship. An American tank destroyed in the same battle could be replaced within weeks, if not days, by the sheer volume of output from the United States. It was not about whether the Sherman was better than the Tiger, it was about whether Germany could keep up. And the answer, as the war ground on, was obvious. Reports from the front grew increasingly grim. Commanders described firefights where elite German tank crews destroyed Shermans in ambush after ambush, only to be overwhelmed when new waves of tanks arrived. The sense of futility spread quickly. German generals reading these reports recognized a truth they could scarcely admit. Even victory in battle could not turn the tide if America's factories continued to operate at such a pace. They were not just fighting soldiers, they were fighting the assembly line. The logistical pipeline that carried tanks from factory floors to Normandy beaches was another marvel that left German planners incredulous. The Allies had built artificial harbors, known as mulberries, to unload tanks and supplies directly onto French shore. Within days of the D-Day landings, these harbors were delivering vehicles at a rate that stunned observers. A tank built in Detroit could be loaded onto a ship in New Jersey, carried across the Atlantic in a convoy, unloaded in Normandy, and rolling through French villages within weeks. For Germany, where transport bottlenecks and fuel shortages crippled movement, this speed was almost unthinkable. Captured officers later admitted that they underestimated the importance of America's industrial culture. The Germans viewed war as an extension of military tradition, with emphasis on training, tactics, and engineering superiority. The Americans, however, treated war as a problem of logistics and production. They believed that quantity, sustained endlessly, could grind down any opponent, and Normandy was proving them right. The psychological shock was perhaps the greatest of all. For German soldiers on the ground, the sight of fresh Shermans arriving endlessly was demoralizing. Every destroyed tank seemed to be replaced instantly, erasing the satisfaction of victory. German tank crews, once the terror of the battlefield, began to feel hunted. Even their victories tasted hollow. For every Sherman knocked out, more seemed to appear the next day. German generals who reviewed these reports understood the creeping despair. Their men were fighting a war they could no longer win. The Americans also proved adept at keeping their tanks operational once they arrived. Mobile repair depots followed the armies, ensuring that damaged Shermans could be patched up and returned to the fight. Spare parts were abundant, unlike in Germany where shortages often left tanks idle for lack of a single component. To Axis spies and generals alike, this constant stream of functioning armor was maddening. The Americans were not only producing more tanks, they were keeping them in the fight far longer. German generals wrestled with the bitter irony of the situation. Their tanks were technologically superior, but in wars superiority without numbers was meaningless. America's Shermans were often derided as Ronsons, or death traps by German crews. Yet those same crews learned to fear them because of the endless tide in which they arrived. 10 Shermans against 1 Tiger tilted the odds. No matter how skilled the German crew, it was attrition in its purest form, and Germany had no answer. As the Allies pushed deeper into France, the reports became undeniable. The Sherman was not a masterpiece of engineering, but it was the right tool for the job. Its abundance overwhelmed German defenses, its reliability ensured it kept rolling, and its steady arrival from American assembly lines ensured that the Allied advance never lost momentum. German generals, raised on a tradition of precision and craftsmanship, could not believe what they were seeing. Tanks that seemed fresh from the factory floor were already grinding across the hedgerows of Normandy, and there were always more to come. In hindsight, the lesson was clear. The Americans had redefined warfare. The battlefield was no longer won solely by superior weapons or brilliant tactics, but by the relentless rhythm of production. German generals who once sneered at the Sherman realized too late that the true weapon was not the tank itself, but the factory that produced it. And in that war, the Americans had built an arsenal too vast to defend. The deeper the Allies pushed inland from Normandy, the clearer the industrial imbalance became. German generals who had once dismissed reports of American tanks arriving fresh from factories now faced mounting evidence on every battlefield. Shermans rolled forward in seemingly endless numbers, their tracks caked with the same Normandy mud that bogged down the Tigers and Panthers. Yet while German armor grew scarcer each week, the Shermans seemed to multiply, as if the American supply chain were inexhaustible. Field officers reported encounters where their units destroyed dozens of Shermans in ambushes, only to face equal or greater numbers the very next day. German commanders, accustomed to calculating attrition ratios, found themselves unable to grasp the scale of replacement. Their own factories struggled to replace even a fraction of their losses, crippled by Allied bombing and resource shortages. For every Tiger that left a German assembly hall, dozens of Shermans were already on ships bound for France. To the generals studying these reports, it felt less like warfare, and more like drowning in an industrial tide. The speed of America's logistical pipeline was equally stunning. Tanks built in Detroit could roll off an assembly line, be loaded onto a transport ship within days, and arrive in Normandy within weeks. From the moment steel was shaped into armor plate, to the moment it faced German fire, the timeline was shockingly short. German generals, used to production cycles that spanned months, could not believe that such efficiency was possible. It defied their understanding of war. To them, tanks were carefully crafted weapons. To America, they were mass-produced instruments of relentless pressure. The Mulberry harbors built after D-Day amplified this shock. German intelligence reports described vast artificial ports, where ships unloaded not only food, fuel and ammunition but also brand new tanks. These floating harbors defied conventional military logic, allowing the Allies to bypass destroyed infrastructure and keep the flow of supplies unbroken. For German planners, the realization was crushing. They were no longer fighting just armies but entire systems, factories, convoys, depots, harbors, all working in perfect synchronization. On the battlefield, German soldiers recognized the consequence. A Tiger tank crew might destroy 5 Shermans in a single engagement, yet still be forced to retreat under the sheer weight of numbers. Infantrymen who once celebrated the arrival of panzers began to despair when they saw fresh Shermans appear beyond the smoke of battle. The sense of inevitability seeped into German ranks. Their tanks were superior, but superiority meant little when outnumbered 10-1. American commanders understood the value of this momentum. They did not need to win every duel. They needed only to keep pressing forward. The Sherman was not designed to outmatch the Tiger. It was designed to be good enough and available in overwhelming numbers. German generals who studied captured documents later realized that this philosophy was deliberate. The Americans did not worship perfection, they worshipped efficiency, and in the crucible of Normandy, efficiency proved deadlier than craftsmanship. Repair and recovery operations reinforced this advantage. The Americans established mobile workshops and spare parts depots across France, ensuring that damaged Shermans returned to combat quickly. German crews often abandoned disabled tanks because replacement parts were scarce. Americans, by contrast, had entire units devoted to recovery, repair, and rapid redeployment. For every Sherman knocked out, 2 might be repaired and sent back into battle within days. German generals, poring over interrogation reports, were stunned by the scale of this logistical safety net. The psychological effect of fresh Shermans arriving daily cannot be overstated. German tank crews began referring to them bitterly as endless enemies. Even victories felt hollow. One Panther commander recalled destroying 7 Shermans in an afternoon, only to face another column the next morning. It was like emptying the sea with a bucket, he lamented after the war. German generals reading these accounts realized that their men were not merely losing battles, they were losing hope. The contrast between German and American factories underscored the futility. German plants, bombed repeatedly by Allied air raids, produced tanks in fits and starts. Shortages of steel, fuel, and labor slowed output to a crawl. In some cases, tanks left assembly lines incomplete, missing parts that had to be scavenged later. American factories, shielded by geography and powered by vast resources, ran continuous. Trains delivered raw materials day and night. Assembly lines never stopped, and every week saw thousands of tons of armor leave for the ports. German generals could not fathom such abundance. This industrial imbalance turned every battlefield into a test of endurance that Germany could not pass. For every tank destroyed, America produced another. For every convoy sunk, 3 more arrived. For every battlefield loss, replacements came fresh from the factory floor. German generals began to realize that their war was not simply against American soldiers, it was against the American system, and that system was unbreakable. By the end of July 1944, the reports were undeniable. America was delivering tanks straight from assembly lines to Normandy at a pace Germany could never match. The shock among German generals was not only in the numbers, but in what those numbers meant. The war had become one of attrition, and in such a war America's factories were invincible. The precision of the Tiger was no match for the persistence of the Sherman, and as more fresh tanks rolled ashore, German high command faced a bitter truth. They had underestimated not only America's soldiers, but also its machines, and the assembly lines that never stopped feeding them. By August 1944, as the Allies broke out of Normandy and surged across France, German generals were forced to confront the brutal truth of American production. Their own panzer divisions, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, were dwindling in both numbers and morale. The battlefield was becoming a contest of attrition, and in that contest, Germany was hopelessly outmatched. Reports from the front made the disparity painfully clear. Where German tanks were lost and rarely replaced, American Shermans appeared in fresh columns week after week, many still gleaming from the factory floor. The Germans had once believed that their technological edge would offset America's numbers. The Tiger, Panther, and even the older Panzer IV had been designed to dominate through firepower and armor, and in one-on-one duels, a Tiger could destroy a Sherman before the American tank even got within range. But these victories were meaningless when more Shermans arrived in relentless waves. German commanders began to admit privately that they were being buried under steel, not beaten by tact. Intelligence officers traced the problem back to America's factories. They marveled at how quickly production adapted the battlefield needs. Reports indicated that modifications, such as improved armor or new gun mounts, were incorporated into Sherman designs in mere weeks. In Germany, design changes required endless testing and debate, delaying improvements for months or years. The Americans, by contrast, embraced speed over perfection. To German generals, this approach seemed reckless, yet it worked. By the time a new Tiger variant reached the field, hundreds of Shermans with updated features had already arrived. Logistics widened the gap further. German tanks, powerful though they were, suffered constant breakdown. Panthers required extensive maintenance, Tigers consumed fuel at alarming rates, and both were difficult to repair under combat conditions. Spare parts were scarce, and mechanics often cannibalized damaged tanks to keep others running. American Shermans, on the other hand, were designed for simplicity. Parts were interchangeable, engines were reliable, and repair crews had an endless supply of replacements. German generals reviewing battle reports could hardly believe the efficiency of this system. Tanks that might have been lost forever under German doctrine were back in action within days under American support. The Mulberry harbors continued to astonish. German spies captured after the war described the vast artificial ports as miracles of engineering. Thousands of tons of supplies poured through them daily, including tanks rolling straight off ships onto French soil. The sheer scale of the operation left German planners dumbfounded. Their own supply lines depended on fragile rail networks constantly harassed by Allied bombers. The Americans had effectively built floating cities to sustain their advance. To the generals reading intelligence reports, it was as though America's factories extended their assembly lines across the Atlantic. Morale among German tank crews suffered accordingly. Veteran commanders who once boasted of their superiority in armored combat now spoke bitterly of the futility of fighting endless Shermans. Stories circulated of units destroying 20 or 30 tanks in a day, only to face fresh columns the next morning. These tales were no longer triumphs but warnings. German soldiers began to call the Sherman the Swarm, a relentless tide that could not be halted. Generals analyzing these accounts realized that their greatest fear had come true. Quality could not compensate for quantity when the gap was this vast. The cultural contrast deepened the sting. German propaganda had long mocked the United States as a nation of soft consumers, incapable of enduring hardship. Yet on the battlefield, it was clear that America's consumer culture had been transformed into military power. The same assembly lines that once built automobiles now delivered tanks. The same emphasis on mass production that filled American supermarkets now filled Normandy with armor. To German generals steeped in ideals of sacrifice and craftsmanship, the lesson was bitter. Abundance, not austerity, was winning the war. Captured officers later confessed their disbelief at how casually the Americans treated their tanks. Some described watching Shermans drive into battle with chalk markings still scrawled on their armor, notes from factories or shipping crews. To them it looked careless, even cruel. But the Americans understood that a tank did not need to be perfect. It needed to be there, in numbers, supporting the infantry, moving the line forward. German generals could not accept this at first, but as their forces crumbled, they realized that America's philosophy of good enough, built fast, built many, was the true key to victory. The sense of inevitability grew stronger as the Allies advanced. German divisions, weakened and undersupplied, were forced to retreat again and again before the tide of fresh armor. Generals who had once believed in the invincibility of the Panzer Corps now faced the reality of dwindling fuel, broken tanks and demoralized crew. Against them rolled Shermans that seemed brand new, as though the factories of Detroit had a direct conveyor belt to the French countryside. In hindsight, the shock of seeing tanks delivered straight from the assembly line to Normandy was not just about number, it was about what those numbers represented. America had fused industry and warfare into a single unstoppable system. German generals, trained to see victory in terms of battlefield brilliance, were forced to confront a new reality. Wars were no longer won solely by tactics or technology. They were won by factories, supply chains, and the ability to sustain pressure indefinitely. And in that realm, America's dominance was absolute. As the Allies swept through France in the late summer of 1944, the disbelief among German generals turned to dread. They had once ridiculed reports of America sending tanks straight from the factory floor to Normandy. Now every battlefield confirmed it. The Sherman tank, dismissed as inferior, became the visible proof of a system Germany could not match. What unnerved the generals most was not that the Sherman was better, it wasn't. It was that America produced them faster than Germany could destroy them. Frontline reports described engagements where German Panthers and Tigers outgunned the Shermans, knocking out several in a single clash. Yet even as these victories were logged, fresh waves of Shermans appeared the next day. German generals reviewing these accounts realized that their armored units were trapped in an unwinnable cycle. No matter how skilled their crews or how advanced their tanks, They were being buried under sheer numbers. And those numbers were arriving with shocking speed. The production model behind this feat fascinated and horrified Axis intelligence analysts. America's assembly lines had been refined during decades of automotive manufacturing. What had once produced Fords and Chevrolets now produced Shermans. The difference was that tanks rolled out at a pace the Germans could not imagine. Skilled labor in Germany was dwindling, diverted to repair bombed cities or lost to the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, in America, men and women alike worked in shifts around the clock, supported by a vast industrial infrastructure untouched by war. Tanks were not handmade marbles. They were stamped, welded, painted, and shipped with conveyor belt precision. This approach also meant that Shermans were designed for speed of production and ease of maintenance rather than perfection. They were lighter than German tanks, with thinner armor and smaller guns, but they were simple to repair, and their parts were interchangeable. A destroyed Sherman was tragic, but a damaged Sherman was rarely lost for long. German generals, accustomed to tanks that required painstaking work to restore, could not believe how quickly Shermans returned to battle after being knocked out. Mobile workshops, backed by endless supplies of spare parts, made sure of the sheer efficiency of American logistics widened the gap. German supply lines were crumbling under relentless Allied bombing. Railroads were shredded, fuel supplies dwindling, and convoys constantly attacked. In contrast, the Allies seemed to conjure supply networks out of nothing. Artificial harbors like Mulberry kept the flow of tanks uninterrupted. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with mathematical regularity. By late 1944, some German officers reported that Shermans were arriving in France faster than their intelligence networks could track them. Morale among German troops suffered accordingly. Tank crews who once bragged of their superiority now whispered of futility. They knew their Tigers could destroy a Sherman at long range, but they also knew that every Tiger lost was irreplaceable. Shermans, on the other hand, were as common as the infantry they supported. Stories of fields littered with burning Shermans no longer felt like victories. They felt like omens, because the next day the fields would be filled again with more tanks, fresh from America's factory. The psychological divide became clear in prisoner interrogations. German soldiers captured in Normandy often expressed astonishment at how casually American troops treated their equipment. Some described seeing Shermans still marked with factory chalk, as though they had rolled directly from Detroit into battle. To them it was unthinkable. Their own tanks were revered, treasured, maintained like works of art. The Americans treated theirs like disposable tools, and in doing so ensured they never ran out. Even German generals, many of whom had sneered at American industry before the war, began to admit the truth privately. They realized that the Sherman was not designed to win tank duels but to support infantry and maintain momentum. In that role it excelled. Its numbers meant breakthroughs could be exploited, and its reliability meant advances did not stall. German reports increasingly noted that wherever the Allies attacked, Shermans were present in overwhelming force. For generals raised on the belief that superior design triumphed over mass, this was a bitter lesson. The cultural implications also gnawed at them. German ideology exalted sacrifice and scarcity as virtues. America exalted abundance and practicality. To German officers, this seemed decadent. Yet in practice, it was devastatingly effective. America's tanks were not symbols of austerity but of plenty, rolling reminders that the Allies could fight and live well simultaneously. In every burning Sherman replaced by another, German soldiers saw proof of their own nation's weakness. The lesson of Normandy echoed far beyond. German generals came to understand that modern war was not decided by the brilliance of a single machine, but by the rhythm of entire industries. Their Tigers were magnificent, but they were too few, too costly, and too slow. America's Shermans were many, simple and constant, and in the end constancy beat brilliance. Tanks that rolled straight from assembly lines to Normandy were not just weapons, they were messages. They told the Germans that the war had shifted irreversibly into one of attrition, and in that war, America's factories were unbeatable. By the time Allied forces advanced toward the German border, the disbelief had given way to resignation. German generals could no longer deny what they had seen. America had redefined warfare. Victory was not only forged in battles but in factory. And as Shermans kept arriving fresh from assembly lines thousands of miles away, German high command knew the truth. They were fighting not just armies but the inexhaustible engine of American industry. By the autumn of 1944, German generals no longer debated whether America could deliver tanks straight from the factory floor to the battlefield. They knew it was true. What unsettled them now was the realization that this system seemed unstoppable. Every time they recalculated their odds, factoring in the attrition of their own dwindling armored divisions, the numbers collapsed against them. The American supply chain functioned like an unbroken artery, pumping new armor into Normandy across France and toward Germany itself. The Wehrmacht's own situation could not have been more different. Allied bombing raids hammered factories at Kassel, Essen, and beyond, crippling production. Skilled labor was in short supply, as more and more workers were drafted to fight or diverted to repairing bomb damage. Fuel shortages worsened daily. Even when tanks were produced, transporting them to the front became a nightmare. Railroads were shattered, and fuel for trucks was scarce. German generals reading reports from the field realized that their armored divisions were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs while the Americans advanced with both hands free and an assembly line constantly at their back. The operational difference became painfully clear during the rapid Allied advance after the breakout at St. Lo. German panzer units tried to regroup and counterattack, but they were overwhelmed by Allied numbers. For every tank they fielded, the Americans fielded 3, sometimes 5. Generals accustomed to maneuver warfare realized they were being dragged into a contest of attrition. They could not win. In this contest, the factory floor in Detroit was as decisive as any battlefield general. Reports described Shermans arriving in waves, many still bearing the sheen of new paint. They looked less like battered veterans of war, and more like products fresh from a showroom. German commanders who had once scoffed at the Sherman's thin armor now cursed it for its ubiquity. It was everywhere, supporting infantry, spearheading offensives, and rolling over defenses. Even when destroyed, replacements seemed to materialize overnight. To the German mind, trained to equate scarcity with valor, this abundance was incomprehensible. Captured officers confessed their frustration under interrogation. One panzer commander admitted that his men grew demoralized, not because the Sherman was invincible, but because it never stopped coming. "We destroyed them in fields, in villages, on roads," he said, "and still they returned, as if factories poured directly into France." His words captured the essence of German disbelief. They were not fighting against machines alone, but against the very concept of unlimited production. The Mulberry harbors and supply depots reinforced this sense of futility. German intelligence had initially underestimated the Allies' ability to sustain their invasion, but by late 1944 it was clear that the Americans had mastered logistical warfare. Convoys arrived like clockwork. Trains and trucks distributed supplies with astonishing speed. Tanks rolled off ships and onto French roads in seamless succession. German generals realized that no amount of tactical brilliance could offset such an advantage. Even victories on the battlefield evaporated in the face of America's industrial tide. The contrast with Germany's own production philosophy was stark. German tanks were marvels of engineering, but they were too complex for mass output. Each Tiger was a masterpiece, but also a burden, heavy, fuel-hungry, and expensive. A Tiger lost in combat represented months of labor and irreplaceable materials. A Sherman lost was a footnote, easily replaced by another rolling off the line. German generals who prided themselves on precision now faced the bitter truth that precision without scale was defeat. The psychological blow of this realization was immense. Tank crews who once believed in their superiority began to feel like relics of an outdated doctrine. Infantrymen who once cheered at the sight of panzers grew cynical, knowing that the enemy had far more armor in reserve. Even civilians watching Allied tanks pour across France began to sense the inevitability of defeat. For German generals, this erosion of morale was as destructive as the tanks themselves. The Americans also demonstrated an uncanny ability to repair and recycle. Damaged Shermans were quickly hauled to field workshops, patched up and sent back into combat. German tanks, by contrast, often sat idle for lack of parts or fuel. Generals reviewing the reports could not believe how efficiently the Americans kept their machines in the fight. Every Sherman seemed to fight 2 or 3 times over its lifetime, while German tanks were lost for good with each breakdown. Culturally, the lesson was humiliating. German ideology had long portrayed Americans as weak, soft, and overly reliant on machines. Yet in Normandy that reliance proved to be their greatest strength. The Sherman was not a symbol of weakness, but of relentless momentum. German generals who once sneered at mass production now recognized it as the deciding factor of the war. By the end of 1944, the disbelief had hardened into grim acceptance. America's ability to deliver tanks straight from the factory to the battlefield had shattered the myth of German armored supremacy. The Wehrmacht's famed panzer divisions were no longer symbols of unstoppable power, but reminders of a bygone era, overwhelmed by an enemy that fought with factories as much as with soldiers. For the generals who had once laughed at the Sherman, the laughter was gone. In its place was the bitter knowledge that the war was being lost, not only in fields and forests, but in the assembly lines of America. As autumn turned to winter in 1944, German generals found themselves haunted by a grim refrain: the Americans could not be stopped because their tanks could not be stopped. It was not simply the Sherman itself, though its reliability and adaptability were impressive, but the unbroken flow of machines that poured from American factories straight into the war zone. To officers trained in the logic of scarcity, it was unthinkable. Yet every new report from Normandy, from the Falaise Gap and later from the Siegfried Line confirmed the truth. America had fused production with war in a way Germany never could. The Allies' operational tempo reflected this abundance. With fresh Shermans arriving continuously, American generals could plan offensives, with confidence that their losses would be quickly replaced. German commanders, by contrast, were paralyzed by shortage. Every decision to commit panzers carried immense weight. If a Tiger was destroyed, the loss was permanent. If a Sherman was destroyed, another would appear within weeks. This imbalance shifted strategy itself. The Allies fought aggressively, knowing they could sustain momentum. Germany fought cautiously, knowing that every loss drained strength that could not be recovered. The reality on the ground was crushing. German tank crews often found themselves outnumbered 5 to 1, sometimes more. In the hedgerows of Normandy, ambushes occasionally tipped the balance, but in open country the tide of Shermans was unstoppable. Reports circulated of villages where German tanks inflicted heavy losses on American armor, only to retreat days later before fresh units that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Generals analyzing these events realized they were fighting not against individual tanks, but against an industrial system. American efficiency extended far beyond the factory. The system of supply depots, pipelines, and transport vehicles kept the armor flowing like blood through arteries. German generals were stunned by the speed with which damaged tanks were recovered, repaired, and returned to combat. Workshops followed the armies manned by engineers who seemed to conjure spare parts out of thin air. A Sherman that might have been written off as destroyed in German service often reappeared days later, patched and ready. This gave the Americans not only more tanks, but the appearance of an endless reserve. The cultural divide between the two nations deepened the stick. German doctrine prized excellence in design, precision in engineering, and devotion to craftsmanship. The Tiger and Panther were marvels of these values, but they were also symbols of inefficiency in the face of industrial war. America valued practicality, speed, and standardization. Its tanks were not masterpieces, they were tools, and in war, tools produced in great numbers were more decisive than masterpieces built in handfuls. German generals reviewing the evidence could not escape this conclusion. By late 1944, the myth of German armored invincibility was shattered. Soldiers in the field no longer believed that their panzers guaranteed superiority. Instead, they feared being overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of Shermans. This shift in morale filtered back to headquarters, where generals recognized its significance. Wars were not won by machines alone, but by the confidence of the men who fought them. And when confidence faltered, defeat followed swiftly. The Allied advance toward Germany underscored this lesson. From the breakout at Saint-Lô to the drive across France, Shermans led the way. Fresh tanks arrived almost as quickly as the front advanced. German generals were astonished by the logistical rhythm that sustained this pace. To them it was as though America had constructed an invisible bridge from Detroit to the Rhine, carrying tanks across the ocean in a seamless stream. No matter how many were lost in battle, replacements always seemed to arrive on schedule. Prisoner interrogations revealed just how deeply this abundance unsettled German officers. Captured commanders often admitted their shock at facing Shermans with paint so fresh it glistened in the sun. Some described the bitter irony of destroying tanks in combat only to learn that replacements had landed at Cherbourg or Le Havre within days. One general remarked that it felt as though the Americans had factories hidden just beyond the front line. In a way, he was not wrong.
The combination of transatlantic shipping, Mulberry harbors, and mobile workshops made the system function as if the factory floor stretched all the way into Normandy. The strategic implications were devastating. Germany had gambled everything on short, decisive wars, where precision weapons and tactical brilliance could deliver victory. But in Normandy, that gamble collapsed. The war became one of attrition. And in attrition, America's factories were unmatched. German generals, once so confident in their tanks, now confessed that they were watching their armored doctrine collapse under the weight of industrial reality. By winter, the writing was on the wall. Even the Ardennes offensive, Germany's desperate gamble, was fueled more by hope than by resources. The Americans lost Shermans in large numbers during the Battle of the Bulge, but replacements arrived swiftly, restoring strength. German losses, however, could not be replaced. For generals who had once believed in German superiority, the experience was humiliating. They had sneered at American tanks, but the sneer had turned to silence. Tanks fresh off the assembly line rolled through Normandy, through France, and now pointed directly at the heart of Germany. By the dawn of 1945, the industrial miracle of American tank production had fully revealed itself. German generals no longer questioned whether America could deliver Sherman straight from the assembly line to the battlefield. They had witnessed it too many times. Instead, their discussions turned to the strategic consequences of that reality. What they saw was a war that had shifted irreversibly out of their control. The armored spearheads that once symbolized German dominance now fought on the defensive, bleeding strength with every encounter. The Allies, meanwhile, pushed forward relentlessly. At every major engagement, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the crossings of the Seine, new Shermans appeared in numbers that astonished the defender. Tanks bearing fresh markings and factory-fresh paint were common sights, reminders that America's factories were fighting alongside its soldiers. To German commanders, this was more than a logistical feat. It was psychological warfare. Every gleaming Sherman was proof that their enemy's strength was unending. What made the situation unbearable for German planners was the speed of replacement. They had once calculated that knocking out a certain number of Shermans would delay the Allied advance, but by late 1944 that calculation was meaningless. A unit that destroyed 20 Shermans in 1 week might face 30 new ones the next. Reports from the front described the frustration of tank crews who fought valiantly, only to see their victories erased overnight. Generals studying these reports recognized the futility. America's system turned defeat into mere inconvenience. The Germans also understood that this industrial edge reshaped Allied strategy. American commanders could plan offensives, knowing their armor would always be replenished. Losses that would have crippled a German division were simply absorbed by the Americans. This gave the Allies freedom of maneuver, allowing them to attack boldly and recover quickly. German generals, restricted by scarcity, found themselves forced into defensive postures, unable to gamble with their dwindling panzers. It was not a question of courage or skill, but of math, and the math was crushing. The repair and recovery system only deepened this imbalance. Mobile depots followed the advancing armies, staffed with engineers who worked around the clock to salvage and restore damaged tanks. A Sherman knocked out by enemy fire might be dragged back, repaired and returned to combat within days. German tanks, by contrast, were often left behind, too damaged or too complex to repair without scarce parts. Generals noted bitterly that the Americans seemed to get multiple lives out of each Sherman, while their own losses were permanent. The logistical network that sustained this system impressed even enemy observers. From American factories to French battlefields, the chain was seamless. Steel left Pittsburgh, engines left Detroit, parts left Chicago, and all converged in ports where convoys sailed like clockwork. The Mulberry harbors, followed by captured ports, transformed Normandy into a direct extension of the American production line. To German generals, it was as though an assembly line thousands of miles long stretched across the Atlantic, delivering war machines straight to the front.
The cultural implications weighed heavily as well. German ideology had exalted sacrifice, insisting that strength came from endurance. America rejected this entirely. Its soldiers fought not by embracing suffering, but by rejecting it. They marched into battle with reliable food, cigarettes, chocolate, and Coca-Cola, and above all with tanks that never stopped arriving. German generals, raised in a culture that equated hardship with honor, could not reconcile this philosophy with the reality of defeat. Yet reality was undeniable. Abundance had proven stronger than sacrifice. Civilian morale in occupied Europe reflected this contrast. As Shermans rolled through liberated towns, locals often marveled at their freshness, noting the paint, the markings, even the smell of oil that lingered. For people who had endured years of scarcity, the sight of brand new machines symbolized a future of plenty. Axis propaganda that painted America as decadent collapsed against the tangible evidence of abundance. German spies reported these impressions, and generals could only grimly acknowledge how thoroughly the war of images had been lost. By early 1945, some German generals began admitting privately what they could not say publicly. The war had been lost the moment America's factories went to war. They recognized that Normandy was not just a battlefield, but a demonstration. The Shermans that rolled off assembly lines and into combat proved that Germany was fighting an enemy whose strength could not be exhausted. For every tank destroyed, 10 more waited. For every victory, the tide rose higher. The myth of German armored invincibility, built on the triumphs of the early war years, was shattered. No matter how fearsome the Tiger or the Panther, they could not alter the arithmetic of production. German generals had once laughed at the Sherman as a crude, clumsy machine. Now they saw it for what it was, the embodiment of a system that made their laughter obsolete. The Sherman was not just a tank, it was the physical proof that America's factories had become the true arsenal of democracy. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pressed into the heart of Germany, the disbelief of German generals had turned into bitter resignation. The stories of tanks arriving fresh from American factories were no longer tales from the front, but daily reality. Entire armored divisions seemed to regenerate overnight, fueled not by desperation but by the steady hum of assembly lines thousands of miles away. To generals accustomed to rationing every shell and every drop of fuel, this abundance felt surreal. Reports from the Western Front described the same pattern over and over again. German units, entrenched along defensive lines, destroyed dozens of Shermans during engagement. Yet within days, new columns of tanks appeared, as though the battlefield had reset itself. This rhythm wore down even the most hardened commanders. They knew that their own replacements would never come in time if they came at all. America's factories, untouched by war, ensured that the Allies always had more. The statistics were damning. By 1944, American industry was producing nearly 50,000 tanks per year. German output struggled to reach a fraction of that number, and even then, Allied bombing constantly disrupted production. Factories hit by bombs required weeks to resume work, and some never reopened. America, shielded by oceans, faced no such interruption. Its factories worked day and night, powered by an industrial base that seemed limitless. German generals understood the implications. Every battle was a race against time, and time was on America's side. The difference in philosophy grew more glaring as the war dragged on. German tanks like the Tiger and Panther were engineering marvels, but they were also maintenance nightmares. They consumed fuel in staggering quantities, required extensive upkeep, and broke down often. A single Tiger lost in battle was a national setback. The Sherman, by contrast, was built for simplicity. It was easy to drive, easy to repair, and easy to replace. German generals who had once scoffed at its design now recognized the wisdom of it. A weapon did not need to be perfect, it needed to be present in number. German intelligence officers admitted their frustration openly in captured documents. One report described the Sherman as the ant that devours the lion, a small but relentless adversary that multiplied faster than it could be killed. Generals reading such reports conceded that their own strategy had failed. They had built lions, but the battlefield belonged to ants. Countless, tireless, unending. The logistics behind this imbalance impressed even enemy observers. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with machine-like regularity, escorted by powerful navies that neutralized the U-boat threat. Ports in France unloaded ships at unprecedented speed, funneling tanks onto roads and railways that carried them to the front. German generals compared this system to their own fractured supply lines and despaired. Where their railways lay in ruins and fuel stocks dwindled, America's flow of tanks never faltered. The psychological toll on German troops was immense. Soldiers who once trusted the panzers to hold the line now muttered about the endless Shermans. Even when German armor won duels, The victories felt empty. A village retaken one day would be lost the next, overrun by fresh waves of American tanks. The sense of inevitability seeped into every battle. Generals recognized this erosion of morale and knew it was fatal. A soldier who believes defeat is inevitable is already half defeated. The Allies exploited this perception skillfully. Propaganda units spread images of columns of Shermans rolling through liberated towns, their crews smiling, their machines spotless. Civilians who had lived through years of scarcity were awed by the sight. German civilians too began to whisper about the abundance that followed the Allies. The message was unmistakable. The Reich, once feared for its might, was being crushed by a nation that could send brand new tanks across an ocean without hesitation. In hindsight, German generals admitted that the war had been lost not on the battlefield but in the factory. The assembly lines of Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh were as decisive as the beaches of Normandy or the fields of France. The myth of German technological superiority had collapsed under the weight of American pragmatism. For every Tiger, there were dozens of Sherman. For every German setback repaired over weeks, America delivered fresh tanks daily. By April 1945, as Allied armor closed in on Berlin, the sight of new Shermans rolling through shattered German towns was no longer shocking. It was expected. German generals who had once laughed at the notion of America's industrial might now bowed to its reality. They had underestimated their enemy, mocked his machines, and ignored his factory. Now those factories had rolled right up to their doorstep, carried on the backs of tanks straight from the assembly line. The lesson was clear. In modern war, the factory was the battlefield. And in that war, America had already won. By the final months of the war, German generals no longer bothered mocking the Sherman tank. The laughter that had once filled briefings was gone, replaced by grim silence. They had seen the truth too many times. America's tanks did not stop. They arrived fresh from assembly lines, crossed oceans, and poured into battlefields with a speed that Germany could not hope to match. Each new wave of Shermans was another reminder that their enemy's strength lay not just in soldiers but in factories. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, offered one final test. In the frozen forests of Belgium, German panzers struck hard, catching the Allies by surprise. For a brief moment it seemed the old superiority of German armor had returned. Shermans burned in the snow, and German tank crews felt a flicker of triumph. But that triumph lasted only days. As fresh American tanks poured into the battle, the offensive stalled. German generals were forced to watch their carefully laid plans collapse under the same relentless tide of production that had defined the war since Normandy. Captured documents from the offensive reveal the despair of German officers. They wrote of fuel shortages, broken supply lines, and tanks abandoned for lack of parts. Meanwhile, their enemy replaced losses almost instantly. A destroyed Sherman mattered little. Within weeks, a replacement rolled in. German commanders admitted bitterly that their offensive had failed not because of bravery or tactics, but because of math. The Americans had more tanks, more fuel, more everything. The psychological impact on German soldiers was devastating. Many went into battle believing they could win duels but not wars. They could destroy Shermans but not enough of them. Stories circulated of Tigers ambushing columns, destroying 10 or 12 Shermans, only to be overrun by replacements the next day. Soldiers began to describe the American tanks as endless, like a tide that could not be stopped. Generals recognized that morale was breaking, not from battlefield defeats, but from the certainty of attrition. By contrast, American soldiers carried a confidence born of abundance. They knew reinforcements were always coming, that spare parts and replacements would arrive, and that their efforts were part of a system too vast to fail. German interrogators noted this difference when questioning captured America. The soldiers spoke casually of replacements, of tanks arriving by the shipload, of confidence that their nation stood fully behind them. German generals who read these reports saw the unbridgeable divide. Their soldiers fought with fear of scarcity. The Americans fought with certainty of supply. The cultural humiliation stung deeply. German ideology had long exalted sacrifice, portraying Americans as soft, weak, and incapable of enduring hardship. Yet in reality, America's abundance gave it strength. Soldiers who fought with full bellies, reliable equipment, and even small comforts like chocolate and cigarettes were not weaker.
They were stronger. German generals, raised on doctrines of austerity, now saw that abundance had won the war. The collapse of the Reich only reinforced this truth. As American tanks rolled across the Rhine and into Germany itself, civilians saw machines that looked brand new, as though untouched by months of combat. To them, the message was undeniable. Their nation was exhausted, while America seemed limitless. Even in defeat, German generals could not help but marvel at the sight. Tanks that had been built weeks earlier in American cities were now rumbling through German streets. It felt less like conquest and more like inevitability made real. In post-war reflections, many generals admitted that they had misunderstood the nature of modern war. They had believed in decisive battles, in superior machines, in tactical brilliance. But America had shown that wars were now decided by industry. A tiger might win a duel, but it could not win a war against 10 Shermans, and those Shermans arrived faster than the Tigers could be built, repaired, or fueled. The factory had become the true battlefield, and on that battlefield, Germany never stood a chance. The legacy of this realization endured long after the war ended. German officers who studied the conflict in hindsight often pointed to Normandy as the turning point, not because of tactics, but because of production. They recalled their disbelief as reports confirmed that America was delivering tanks straight from assembly lines to the front. That disbelief had turned to fear, and finally to resignation. They had been outmaneuvered not on the map but on the factory. By May 1945, as Shermans rolled through the ruins of Berlin, the lesson was complete. America's factories had proven as decisive as its armies. German generals who once mocked the Sherman now recognized it as the symbol of their defeat. Not because it was perfect, but because it was plentiful. Not because it was invincible, but because it never stopped coming. It was the embodiment of industrial war, and industrial war was the war America had mastered. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the truth that German generals had resisted for so long could no longer be denied. The Americans had fought with factories as much as with soldiers, and the Shermans that rolled into Normandy straight from the assembly line had been the clearest symbol of that reality. The Germans had laughed at the idea once, mocking the notion that a nation of consumers could master the art of war. But when their cities lay in ruins, and Allied armor filled their streets, the laughter was gone. Captured officers reflected bitterly on what they had witnessed. Many admitted that their greatest shock was not at America's weapons themselves, but at the speed with which those weapons appeared. They spoke of tanks that looked as though they had traveled directly from Detroit into French fields, still carrying the marks of factory paint. They remembered the frustration of destroying columns of Shermans, only to see more appear within days. One officer confessed that it was not the Tigers' defeats that haunted him, but the futility of victories that never last. The lesson was clear. Abundance, not austerity, had determined the outcome of the war. Germany had invested in engineering marvels, in machines designed to intimidate and dominate, but these machines were rare, fragile, and impossible to replace in sufficient number. America, by contrast, had invested in systems, assembly lines, logistics networks, repair depots, and supply chains. The Sherman was the physical proof of those systems, a tank that could be replaced faster than it could be destroyed. For German generals, this was an alien way of war, yet it had proven devastatingly effective. Civilians in liberated Europe felt the difference as keenly as the soldiers. They watched American tanks roll into their towns with markings so fresh they seemed untouched by combat. To them, the sight was more than reassurance of liberation. It was evidence that the Allies could supply not only victory but also stability. German propaganda, which had long painted America as weak, crumbled in the face of such tangible power. Civilians compared their own shortages, their own rationing, with the abundance carried by the Allies, and the contrast spoke louder than any speech. For German generals, the cultural humiliation ran deep. They had built their ideology on the virtues of sacrifice, of suffering, of endurance. America had fought with the opposite values: abundance, comfort, efficiency, and abundance had triumphed. To them, the Sherman became not just a tank, but a declaration that modern war was no longer about who endured the most, but about who produced the most. Tanks that had once been dismissed as crude and inferior were now remembered as the machines that crushed an empire. Even after the surrender, the memory lingered. In post-war studies and memoirs, German generals often wrote with awe of America's industrial system. They noted that it had not merely supplied the front but overwhelmed it, turning every battle into an exercise in futility. They recognized that the true battlefield had been the factory floor, and that the men and women of America's industrial workforce had been as decisive as any soldier. The assembly line, they admitted, had been as lethal as the artillery barrage. Some even speculated on what might have happened if Germany had adopted a similar philosophy. Could they have produced simpler tanks in greater number? Could they have matched America's pace if they had embraced standardization instead of perfection? The answers were academic. The reality was that Germany had gambled on engineering brilliance, and America had answered with relentless production, and production had won. The image of tanks rolling straight from American assembly lines into Normandy became one of the enduring metaphors of the war. It symbolized the moment when the tide turned irrevocably against Germany, when the illusion of armored invincibility collapsed under the weight of industrial might. For the men who had commanded the Wehrmacht, it was a memory they carried into defeat, the realization that their greatest enemy had not been the Sherman itself, but the factory that built it. In the end, the story of those tanks was not just about machines of war, it was about the triumph of a system, the victory of abundance over scarcity, of pragmatism over perfection, of factories over fortresses. German generals who once sneered at the Sherman came to understand too late that it represented the future. Wars would no longer be won by masterpiece, they would be won by assembly lines, and in Normandy, America had proven that truth beyond doubt.